Sugar, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Kynetta McFarlane, and we're going to be defining autism today. And so this is a continuation of the presentation that I started last week. All right, so last week we discussed neurodiversity, and neurodiversity refers to the infinite neurocognitive variability within the Earth's population. It points to the fact that every human has a unique nervous system with a unique combinations of abilities and needs. Now, that quote comes from Judy Singer, who developed this idea as a political and analytical lens for examining social issues such as inequality and discrimination. And we also talked about the medical and the social model. The medical model views disability as a defect within the individual that should be cured, fixed, or eliminated, versus the social model of disability says that a person's disability is based on their inability to participate fully in everyday life. So the social model sees a disability as restrictions imposed by the society, while an impairment are the effects from a condition. So one of the things that I think about in terms of this is late fees. As a person with ADHD, one of the things that I've pay all the time are late fees. And I shouldn't have to pay late fees because literally this is the way that my brain works. This is not me trying not to like turn in something like the day after it's due, because that is the way that my brain works. I often turn in things like the day after it's due. So throughout my life, I've paid like all these extra late fees. And how is that helping anybody in the society? I know it's harming me. Is it helping anybody else? It would be different if that late fee was actually about somebody now has to do extra work. But generally those fees are imposed to encourage people to turn stuff on time. Well, if this is like the way that your brain works, that encouragement doesn't work. So that would be an example of like something that I like as a person with ADHD should be able to say I have ADHD and they take off the late fee because I've paid for it. So the social model says that the way to end discrimination and oppression against people with disabilities is through education, accommodation, and universal design. And if we had more education, this could lead to changes in the way that we all think about disabilities. It could change how like architects think about universal design and how like accessible they make building plans. Governments could consider our rights and needs more when we're actually passing laws if we were under this model. So why is all of this important? Because one of the things in terms of looking at neurodivergence and looking at the neurodivergent, one of the groups underneath that is autism. And so according to the CDC, about 1 in 6 children aged 3 to 17 are diagnosed with a developmental disability. And about 1 in 44 children have been identified with having autism. And this information came from the CDC's Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. One of the things that we know about autism, it occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, but it is 4 times more common among boys than among girls. So research has shown us that there are some overall things that we know about autism. We know that it's a neurological condition. We know that people with autism have a deliberate processing style. And we also know that people with autism also display some certain behaviors. So let's talk about the neurological part. And so when I'm talking about neurology, I'm really talking about brains. And research has shown us that the brains of autistic individuals versus non-autistic individuals, and another name for non-autistic individuals is allistic. So the difference between autistic and allistic brains in areas that regulate attention, decision-making, impulse control, and emotional processing. Research has also shown us that parts of autistic brains appear to have areas that have extra connections or are hyperconnected, while other areas are underconnected in comparison to what we see out of most people's brains. It also appears that pruning, and that's that process where you go through an experience and your brain learns some information and then will like shape itself based off of learning that new information. It appears that autistic brains, the way that they prune is different than allistic brains. And one of the things that we also know is that autistic brains can see smaller details easier, and that they can zero in small details, which can lead to missing the big picture. So we recognize that autism is a developmental disability. It is something that we definitely see that runs in families. And we also know that there's multiple ways to determine it in terms of, even though we know that there is some effects of the brain, there are also other differences. And one of the things that we know in terms of when we look at all these differences in brain structure, one of those areas that we know is different is in terms of zooming in and seeing little details. And this has something to do with the deliberate processing style that you often see from autistic individuals. Autistic people often use logic to figure out problems versus using a gut feeling or an intuition. And part of this is about bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. So in terms of the brain styles, I told you that one of the things that research shows is that autistic brains like zero into the details. And so when you zero into the details, you may miss the big picture. Top-down processing is where you're really looking at the big picture, and then you use that to be able to figure out the pieces. Bottom-up processing is more focused on the details and then uses the details to get to the big picture. And so one of the things that we know about autistic individuals is that they may examine items in their environment individually in a very slow and deliberate way. And this way and style of looking at things has lots of pros and cons. You can see so much detail, you can pick up so much information, but it can also take you a very long time to process information. And a lot of times people who are autistic are accused of overthinking or being too hesitant, and people aren't able to recognize all the extra energy that that you actually end up expending when this is your natural processing style. The next thing that we also know is that autism is associated with certain behaviors that show some level of repetition. And so we can see that in the body or in behaviors. And so when we see it in the body, we call those stemming behaviors. But we'll also see behaviors such as echolalia, which is when somebody repeats words. We'll also see things in terms of people liking to do things at the same time, or to have schedules to be the same. And because dealing with the world where you're taking in all of these tiny little bits of information, dealing with a world with lots of changes can be very stressful. So routines would actually be something that actually helps you function more and actually helps dealing with the world more functional. And so for a lot of people, though, with autism, they know that their repetition is viewed negatively. And so what we often see is what is being called as masking your autism. So the information for a lot of this this training comes from this book, Unmasking Autism. It's an awesome book. It's by Devin Price. They are psychologists with autism. And one of the things that I feel like is very important in doing trauma-informed work is really looking at things from the viewpoint of the person that is actually going through a situation. I think that's very important in terms of me having like a social justice lens and also somebody who works with like marginalized communities. And so I really like this book because it really talks about like autism in terms of like a social justice like aspect, and also talks about like, why do we see like autism like more in boys? And then also like, why do people have to like hide like who they naturally are? So masked autism is any presentation that deviates from that standard image that we've all seen in terms of like what we think about what autism is, or also in what we see in diagnostic tools. And so what often happens is that it misses women, it misses transgender individuals, it misses the global majority, which is people of color, or it misses those in poverty. I'm right now in terms of, this is one of my big areas because I'm about to do testing, and like one of the saddest things in terms of going into assessment is assessment for autism is like $3,000. In terms of like all of the information you have to collect, all the different testing you have to do. You got to get information from the individual, the teachers. You have to analyze all this information. If you're in poverty, you do not generally get this assessment. And so often individuals who will be missed because they don't meet these classic symptoms. And we know that this research and training was developed in terms of seeing this from like the viewpoint of what does this look like in white males? Like that is really what a lot of that early research in terms of the picture of what we got of what autism is and what it looks like. And so if you don't have like that classical like appearance in terms of what we've been trained to see what autism looks like, you can often be ignored. You may be seen as manipulative or aggressive. And one of the things that I love that the author noted is how the difference between being an autistic person who appears innocent and shy versus somebody who appears creepy and awkward can change based off of your race, your size, and your class. Just think about somebody who is awkward in social situations being tiny, petite, and white versus being 6'4", muscular, and Black. Very different presentation appearance of the same behaviors. So one of the things in terms of being like masked, in terms of some people are masking in terms of trying to like fit in and knowing that they're going to get like a negative reaction. And so having to like reduce their symptoms is not always like a choice. To be seen as doing repetitive behaviors can get you looked at more, and getting you looked at more if you're a certain like race, gender, ethnicity, queerness can lead you to more like problems. And so if you're a person who has to go throughout the day reducing the natural way that your body works, that increases your stress levels. that decreases your ability to be able to cope, problem solve, and deal with problems. So a lot of the adults that I work with and the teens that I'm working with now with autism, a lot of the education that I'm giving them is about like the stress aspect of this, in terms of like how much more work you're doing all throughout the day and not being able to recognize it, and also seeing like how does that affect like the way that you experience the world? How does that affect like your emotional expression? Now, white autistics are 19% more likely to be diagnosed with autism than Black autistics, but 65% more likely to be diagnosed than Latinx individuals. The other thing that's a big discussion is the problems with the identification of people with high and low functioning. Don't do that. Because in terms of recognizing that people have differing variabilities, it is very, very hurtful to hear that you're a low functioning individual. And the other thing, outside of how bad that makes individuals feel, the other thing that the author notes is that it also masks how variable people's skills levels can be. So I could be an autistic individual who gets along very well with my coworkers and performs very well. But in my home, if I'm not reminded to eat food, I may die. Because that's something that's actually hard for my brain to pick up with. And if I do not have that scheduling system there, because it's hard for me to feel feelings inside of my body, so I don't feel stuff like hunger, I may die because I can't feel that feeling, right? But then an individual who is nonverbal and may need some specialized assistance in class is a math rock star. And so we have this way of looking at people and assuming based off of what society says is typical and saying whether or not like they function well or not, and really recognizing that people have like a variability in terms of their skill levels. So one of the things that I did in terms of being a diagnostic assessor, one of the things that I say about myself is that I'm trauma-informed and affirming. And one of the things that the autistic community has been discussing a lot is their experience of trauma in terms of wishes not being understood, their viewpoints not being understood, and even in terms of looking at how are they assessed. And so Dr. Montero has developed an assessment tool for the assessment of autism. And I really, really, really like not just her assessment tool, the Make This too, but I also like it in terms of me being trauma-informed and affirming. So Dr. Montero describes autism as a neurobiological brain style difference. And she uses systemic family therapy with autistic families. And one of her goals is to improve the family's ability to see how unique the autistic viewpoint is and to value having multiple viewpoints within a family. And she developed this style after years of reporting on autistic symptoms using the medical model, which focuses on the deficits of an individual. She noted that having this framework sets up everything from a negative perspective from the top, if we are only really focusing on how the individual is different. And so this led for her to change her approach. She started to collect information that would tell her about a child's strengths and differences. She describes autism as a condition that affects a child's language and communication. And so she talks about how autism is a condition that affects a child's social communication and how they respond to sensory information. And she's very specific about the use of language. She's trying to help shape the family's thoughts and beliefs about how all the members have different perspectives and experiences instead of just identifying and looking for deficits. She talks about having an autistic pattern of having strengths and differences versus deficits. Saying someone has a deficit often leaves them and their self and their family having a negative story about their behavior. And it can make them feel like they're not a member of the group. So she talks about how every family member has a different brain style and that each of these different brain styles have strengths and differences versus saying strengths and weaknesses. And she reports that saying weaknesses leads to a stress response. So she's trying to help the family have a story and a conversation about the child having a unique way of organizing their world. She hopes that this fact that they can see the child first, and that autism will become secondary in terms of understanding their child's viewpoint. And so one of the things that she changed up was like the use of saying like repetitive behaviors versus saying sensory uses and interests. Saying that a child has a specific like sensory like uses and interests in terms of like one of the things that's really helpful with autistic individuals is using a sensory like cue to help like get their attention. And so using that versus saying like they're repeatedly stuck on something sounds nicer, but it is also an accurate description of what's going on. The way that sensory information hits their body is different. And so they also have different ways to use sensory information to be able to help and guide them during the day. In terms of like my clients that have such a better day when they have on like earphones, like through head canceling, like earphones, like throughout the day, because it reduces like some of that sensory information and helps them to be able to process and to be able to function. So I hope this overall gave everybody some more like information, because I've talked about autism before. I've talked about it before in terms of with girls and gender, but this is a different way of thinking about it in terms of thinking about it as having a different brain style. Thinking about the fact of like how much stress does it put on somebody's body to have to change up the way that your body naturally functions and the things that naturally like make you feel more regulated to appear normal to other people. So thank y'all so much.